In the 1990s, Walt Disney World was undergoing an image change that saw the resort bring in a host of new attractions aimed at making the parks cooler, edgier, and more modern. And when Epcot's Journey into Imagination closed to make way for a new version of the ride, guests might have been expecting something as spectacular as the much-loved original. But what they got instead was a prime example of the more interesting decisions of 90s Disney World. A ride so poor it wouldn't even last a full 2 years of operation before being replaced, and potentially the very worst ride in Disney World history. The now infamous Journey into Your Imagination. The original Journey into Imagination opened at Epcot in March 1983, 5 months after the park's opening, as the flagship piece of the Kodak-sponsored Imagination Pavilion in the corner of the Future World section of the park. Unlike many of the other pavilions in Future World, whose corporate sponsors often had rigid expectations of the themes and messages their attractions would give, photography company Kodak only gave Disney one basic requirement: that the pavilion should be imaginative. And so Disney took the instruction literally, creating a pavilion themed around human imagination and creativity. A tour through a fantasy world led by the ride's two signature characters, the mystical inventor Dreamfinder and his purple dragon companion, Figment, two audio animatronic figures riding on Dreamfinder's ship, the Dreamcatcher. Dreamfinder and Figment would take guests to the Dreamport, where all the ideas and dreams they had caught would be deposited, and then take them on a tour through the different realms of imagination. The different scenes of the ride, like the arts, literature, performing arts, science and technology, and visual arts. Each detailed scenes containing more Dreamfinder and Figment animatronics alongside special effects, detailing different ways that creativity and imagination can be harnessed. Throughout the journey, the ride's theme One Little Spark would play, a song written for the attraction by the legendary Disney songwriters the Sherman Brothers. Upon exiting the ride, guests could also visit one of two other attractions in the pavilion. First was the Magic Eye Theatre, containing Magic Journeys, a 3D film depicting the imagination of a child. And upstairs in the pavilion's main building was Imageworks, an exhibit containing several interactive kiosks designed to encourage guests to unlock their own imaginations. And Imageworks was also the home of Epcot's iconic Rainbow Tunnel. The original Imagination Pavilion and its flagship ride were outstanding examples of Disney Imagineering. Throughout the 80s, Journey into Imagination was one of Epcot's most popular attractions, and Dreamfinder and Figment were Epcot's most popular characters. To many people, Figment and Dreamfinder were among the very best things about Epcot, and as representatives of one of Future World's original pavilions, they held an important place in the lore of the park. But as loved as they might have been, there was one person who wasn't a fan of Epcot's iconic characters. By the time the early 90s rolled around, then Disney CEO Michael Eisner was worried about the state of many of Disney's attractions. Mainly, he was obsessed with this idea that a large part of the general public just wasn't interested in what he saw as the old-fashioned, boring, outdated Disney theme parks. A key part of Eisner's philosophy at the time was that Disney needed to modernize, and as far as he was concerned, Epcot's Future World was in the most dire need of this modernization. In 1994, Epcot underwent an image change, shedding its original Epcot Center name for the pretty on-the-nose Epcot 94, a reference to the World's Fair ideals at the park. In Future World, the Communicore Pavilion was replaced by Innoventions. At the Imagination Pavilion, the Michael Jackson 4D film Captain EO, which had replaced Magic Journeys in 1986, was itself replaced by the new Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, a show based on the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids movie. The show saw the theatre become the fictional Imagination Institute, an organisation dedicated to the study of imagination as a science. Modernisation efforts continued at Epcot in the following years, and 1996 saw the replacement of Universe of Energy with the painfully 90s Ellen's Energy Adventure, and the closure of World of Motion to make way for Test Track. And allegedly, Eisner was desperate for Journey into Imagination to go too. According to David Koenig, in my favourite Disney history book ever, Realityland, Disney management was always embarrassed by the idea of a somewhat soft topic like imagination having a place in Future World alongside more scientific themes like agriculture, energy, and transportation. But the problem was, Journey into Imagination was still very popular. The ride was consistently Future World's second most popular attraction after Spaceship Earth, and so Disney needed a way for guests to forget about it if they were to hope to justify any changes to the ride's sponsor, Kodak. The book alleges that with the opening of Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, Disney switched the queue line that sat outside the main entrance, so that instead of going into the ride, it would instead go around the side straight to the theatre, bypassing Journey into Imagination. The plan worked, and almost overnight, the attraction dropped from number 2 most popular to number 8, as guests began to forget about Dreamfinder and Figment. In the late 90s, Disney approached Kodak to try and pressure them into financing an updated version of Journey into Imagination. Facing declining profits with the new age of digital cameras, the company wasn't keen on coughing up money they could ill afford to update a theme park ride. However, there was one problem for Kodak. Their main rival Fujifilm had allegedly come to Disney with plans to turn Journey into Imagination into a thrill ride if the Kodak sponsorship ever came to an end. Kodak desperately didn't want Fujifilm's involvement at Disney World. They were even rumoured to have blocked an attempt by the company at the opening of a Mount Fuji roller coaster in Epcot's Japan Pavilion several years earlier. And so, with the prospect of their main rival in the photography industry potentially booting them out of Disney World, they eventually relented and agreed to finance a ride update on one condition. It would have to be done for cheap. And so on October 10th, 1998, Journey into Imagination closed its doors, and the following year the pavilion was ready to welcome guests to the new, modernised version of the ride. The Imagination Pavilion's new ride opened to guests on October 1st, 1999, as another part of a recurring feature on this channel, the Walt Disney World Millennium Celebration. The update would receive a new name, being changed from Journey into Imagination to Journey into Your Imagination. To highlight that this was a new, changed experience, a banner was hung over the entrance to the building, showing the extra words scrawled into a sign bearing the original name. Although, I've never really understood this sign because, look, there's extra space between those two words. Journey into Your Imagination would extend the Imagination Institute theme from Honey, I Shrunk the Audience. Now, the entire pavilion would become the home of the Institute, and the sign in front of the building was replaced with one bearing the Institute's logo. The ride itself would exist as part of the Imagination Institute's open house, as guests would be invited on a tour through the various Imagination laboratories, where they could see how imagination is studied and harnessed. Stepping into the building's front entrance, guests would get their first look at the changes that had been made. No longer would they see the intricate murals that surrounded the loading area, but instead the reception desk at the Institute, filled with office supplies, in the corporate lobby of the building. Across from that, they would see a portrait of the Imagination Institute's chairman, the same character that appeared in Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, Dr. Nigel Channing, played by Monty Python's Eric Idle. And in the picture, they'd see Figment. But as guests were about to discover, they wouldn't see Figment appearing in the ride alongside the Dreamfinder, because Disney had completely removed him. Turning right, they would then walk down the empty corridor that made up the ride's queue, walking past closed doors that pointed to different departments of the Institute, as videos of Nigel Channing played above them, explaining the areas they'd be visiting. Guests would then board their ride vehicles and begin the tour, with a voiceover of Nigel Channing narrating the journey. The first place guests would go would be the Imagination Scanner, which would measure how much imagination they had in their heads. This was a mirror with visual effects playing above guests' reflections. As the scanner finished, the results would show that the guests didn't have any imagination, and Dr. Channing would deride them for this, but would assure them that the exercises they were about to participate in would help fix the problem.
Well, as you can see, there's not much going on upstairs, imagination-wise. That's just perfect for our experiments.
The next room contained the first exercise, the sound exercise, where Dr. Channing would encourage guests to see what they hear. The room was pitch black, and 3D audio would simulate the sound of a train approaching and steaming past the ride vehicle. Basically just a few loudspeakers. Then the ride vehicle moved on to the illusions exercise, where it passed a handful of scenes imitating visual illusions. A giant magnifying glass appearing to stretch the room behind it, a glass table which remained in place when a cinder block crashed through it, and an empty cage where, as the vehicle passed by, a large butterfly would appear inside. The third scene in the ride was the color exercise. 2 large screens on either side of the room, which would light up green while jungle sounds played, and red as a rocket launch played, to emphasize the connection between colors and imagination. I guess.
3, 2, 1.
The fourth exercise was the connections exercise. As guests entered this area, they would finally see Figment, except he was just a drawing on the wall. As they ventured deeper into this exercise, they would be encouraged to stare at points on the ceiling until their imaginations took flight, with the points forming the shapes of various animals. And the final exercise would take place in the Institute's gravity lab, where Dr. Channing would tell guests to look at the world from a different angle, and the vehicles would move through an upside-down house. Really miscellaneous rooms spread out on the ceiling above them. A living room, a bathroom with a running tap, a garage, and a kitchen. At the end of the tour, the imagination scanner would be used for a second time to see how guests' imaginations had improved. This time, they would test off the charts for imagination, and the mirror would drop away with a burst of air as the space in front of them would be filled with random floating objects representing guests' imaginative possibilities. Dr. Channing would praise guests for unlocking their imaginations, and a projection of Figment would briefly appear in the darkness alongside him.
What a brilliant burst of creativity!
Incredible! Awesome! Absolutely fabulous!
I couldn't have imagined a better group.
He would then persuade guests to rush off to Imageworks to use their imaginations further, as their vehicles pulled into the unload dock to end the ride. And that was what replaced the second most popular attraction at Epcot. A few cheap visual effects, and Eric Idle. As you might imagine, the new journey into your imagination was not well received by guests at all, for several reasons. The first was obvious. Dreamfinder and Figment were gone. Figment was there technically, but he took a major backseat to Eric Idle's character, only appearing briefly at the end of the ride as artwork and in the Q videos. Not even referred to by name. His animatronics that once littered the ride had been removed, and any trace of Dreamfinder and the classic Dreamcatcher ship were gone too. In fact, the ride didn't have a single audio animatronic, and the Sherman Brothers song One Little Spark was also missing. The new ride almost seemed to treat its predecessor and its audience with disdain. Guests were insulted for having no imagination, and then taught the correct way imagination should be created in this very sterile, scientific way. A complete departure on the original themes of the pavilion. The whimsical journey through the wonders of free creativity had been turned into an objective, stiff, corporate tour, where imagination was now a measurable resource to generate profit. And really, Journey into Your Imagination is about capitalism. I'm being hyperbolic, but you get the idea. Beyond the removal of the iconic characters and the changing of the messaging, the Imagination Pavilion as a whole had suffered in a number of other ways too. The new attraction had been built in less than a year, financed by a company that didn't really want to do it in the first place, and it was obvious that it simply didn't have the budget to be a worthy successor. The original ride layout first took guests from its loading area through the clouds and onto a large turntable, where they would first meet Dreamfinder and Figment. But with the smaller budget that Kodak had put up for the new version, 35% of the original track was removed. The original loading area was replaced by the new queue, and instead of using the turntable, a chunk of it was built over, with guests walking up a gentle incline as they reached the new loading area, now in the top right corner of the turntable. These cutbacks and changes to the old layout resulted in a much shorter ride, 5 minutes long compared to the original 12. In place of the removed track, Disney built the ride's gift shop and a new version of the interactive ImageWorks exhibit, now downstairs, named ImageWorks The What If Labs, expanding on the ride's lab theme. All of these had a what if question assigned to them, like, what if music were in the air? Or what if you could change your face? Some of the exhibits from the old ImageWorks were recreated, such as the virtual music conductor, and some were completely new, like a face-morphing screen or a photo editing booth. But because ImageWorks was now downstairs, the original version that had existed on the top floor of the building was simply closed and left abandoned, with the staircase that once led to it roped off from guests, and the iconic rainbow tunnel no longer being accessible, permanently closing an entire section of the building. And there was just no hiding that the ride itself felt incredibly cheap. What used to be a ride full of decorative set design, creative ideas, and tons of animatronics was now a collection of lackluster, tacky special effects that seemed to serve a better purpose as disconnected space fillers than any sort of thoughtfully put together ride. I mean, the color lab was just a room with 2 large panels, and the sound lab was completely empty and pitch black. To be fair to it, there were some cool elements of the new ride. The effect with the butterfly was done pretty well, and the upside down house scene does have some cool details. But in my opinion, every scene of the original version just looked so much better than Journey into Your Imagination. Complaints to Disney about their newest attraction were immediate. This was Disney World's biggest downgrade, and guests hated it. It seemed completely nonsensical that Disney would destroy one of their rides just to replace it with this. Not only did guests hate it, Kodak hated it too. Even Michael Eisner, who seemed desperate for the change to happen, was said to have been horrified by how bad the ride was. The complaints were clear. It was cheap and tacky, it had destroyed the original messaging, it was sarcastic and insulting, it had lost the classic song, and it had killed Figment and Dreamfinder. Something had to change. On October 8th, 2001, after barely 2 years of operation, Journey into Your Imagination closed, as Disney desperately attempted to fix the ride as fast as possible. 8 months later, on June 2nd, 2002, they would open a reimagined version of the reimagining, now named Journey into Imagination with Figment. This version of the ride would be a clear salvage operation, with the track and building layout remaining exactly the same, but would at least attempt to give guests more of what they were asking for. Mainly, Figment, the complete focus of the ride, almost an apology for what they made previously. The main sign that stood outside the ride was slightly modified to add a little cutout of Figment in the corner, and a second portrait of Figment next to Nigel Channing was added to the queue. The story of the updated ride would still see it take guests on an open house tour of the Imagination Institute, but one that had been heavily modified to be less cynical, with more of a focus on the need for imagination to be set free, and of course with much more of the purple dragon. The previously mismatched imagination exercises were turned into labs related to the 5 senses. Instead of entering the imagination scanner at the start of the ride, guests were instead welcomed to the Institute by Dr. Nigel Channing, and then interrupted by Figment, who hijacked the tour, causing chaos in the labs. New Figment animatronics were added to the ride as he disrupts the lab experiments. The butterfly in the cage remained, now moved to the other side of the room, so that instead of appearing in the cage, it would disappear as if it had been set free. Similarly, the upside down house scene remained, but was rethemed now to Figment's house, redecorated in bright primary colours, with various figments dotted throughout it. The finale of the ride, where the second imagination scanner had been, now had a second video segment where Dr. Channing agrees that imagination works best when it's set free, and a collection of figments suddenly appear, all singing One Little Spark, which finally made its return. Journey into Imagination with Figment was a much needed update, and one that most guests did seem to enjoy. It had succeeded in bringing back a much loved character and restoring an element of the original ride's messaging, but it was still obvious that this was just a quick fix. Comparing the 1999 and 2002 versions, it's very easy to spot how much of the 99 version remained. This wasn't so much a brand new version of Journey as it was a second attempt at the '99 version. Figment fixed a lot, but it didn't fix everything. Being built on the cutback ride layout meant that it was still a shorter, lesser attraction than it once had been. Elements of it still looked tacky. The upside-down house, in my opinion, looked even worse than it had done. And of course, there was still no Dreamfinder. But this was the way Journey into Imagination would remain. Good enough, but never quite the version that guests would have wanted. The old Imageworks remained closed as its exhibits aged, but the staircase leading up to it remained near the new ride's gift shop, with only that rope blocking it off. And by the early 2010s, the upstairs of the Imagination Pavilion had become a popular spot for Disney World's growing community of urban explorers, and photos and videos began appearing online, showing it in its dilapidated state. Eventually, in 2017, parts of the upstairs were blocked off, and the remainder of it became a DVC lounge. Today, Journey into Imagination with Figment remains operating, as one of Epcot's few remaining dark rides. Large amounts of the short-lived Journey into Your Imagination still remain to this day, and can still be seen throughout the ride, but many Disney fans regularly call for its refurbishment, criticizing the ride as being poorly aged, and begging for a return to the old classic. Every now and again, Disney likes to draw reference to Dreamfinder, but this is pretty much exclusively done to win nostalgia points with the fans that remember him, rather than an earnest attempt to reintroduce him into the parks. He appeared in a run of comic books, he'll sometimes appear as a character on stage at Disney's Fan Expo D23, and in 2023, when Disney reintroduced Figment as a meet and greet character in Imageworks, the artwork on the wall contained the Dreamcatcher. Very few actual remnants of the original Journey into Imagination still exist in the park. Until 2020, visitors to Mouse Gear in the center of Epcot could see a stripped down version of Dreamfinder's Dreamcatcher on the wall. But with the closure of this store, this has now been removed. There are constantly rumors flying around that one day Disney will bring back the original Journey into Imagination, or at least make a modern version with Dreamfinder and Figment together again. In my opinion though, modern Disney just seems completely unwilling to make any new attractions that aren't based on some existing, heavily marketable movie. And so as much as I would love to see Dreamfinder back in the ride, to me it seems far more likely that rather than Journey into Imagination making a full return, the existing ride and Figment may disappear completely. It's pretty ironic that the Imagination Institute was essentially a soulless corporate entity attempting to turn imagination and creativity into just a means to make a profit, because that's exactly what Disney did when they created Journey into Your Imagination. And with Nigel Channing being a company chairman replacing Figment, he might as well have just been Michael Eisner. Journey into Your Imagination was such a perfect example of something that was happening a lot in 90s Disney, which was this strange attempt to add more edginess to the park. A misfire at modernizing Disney, trying to add cheap, cynical jokes to once loved attractions because executives thought that was what guests wanted, before inevitably finding out that's not what they wanted at all. The same thing happened around the same time when Disney built Superstar Limo at California Adventure, probably the worst Disney ride anywhere in the world. And in the early 2000s, they would also do this in an effort to modernize, with the update to the Enchanted Tiki Room. Some of you in the comments of my previous videos have pointed out that this seems to be a characteristic of Michael Eisner himself. Now, Eisner obviously did a lot of good for the company, he basically saved them from collapse, but he also had this strange obsession with snarky humor about the corporate world and the entertainment industry that nobody else found as funny as he did. Did you ever get to experience the short-lived Journey into Your Imagination? What did you think of it? What do you think of the current version? And do you have any hopes of how the Imagination Pavilion might change in the future? Let me know in the comments. And if you liked the video, please consider subscribing, as I'm always working on more theme park videos coming in the future. And as always, I'll see you next time.